similar to Nathan's story, right? Nathan got started by doing similar stuff.
Yeah, creating notes, selling properties on terms is what we called it at the beginning. Like it didn't call it a note, didn't even call it a mortgage. We were doing it. It was land contracts in Ohio, and we were selling houses on terms, and it made a ton of mistakes, but thankfully, we made out okay. But yeah, and then it just kind of goes from there, and then you kind of pick your niche and you figure out, okay, well, I like this, and then you just kind of pursue it. So that's what I did, and then today.
It found me is what I like to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So creative financing is a very hot word, right? Can you give an example of what creative finance really is? I'll give it to Ken. Give it to Ken. How would you define creative financing? Because it seemed like everything in real estate is creative financing, even if it's basic, which isn't true.
Yeah, so it's one of the most misunderstood terms, probably, especially for new real estate investors. But I guess from our perspective, creative financing is just figuring out a deal without the need for traditional banks or institutional funding, right? So it could be a land contract on terms. It could be creating a note. In the case of a sub-2 deal, wrapping, right? You wrap the land contract or you wrap the note, all those sorts of things. So it's basically just figuring out, it's cutting out what I like to say it's cutting out the middleman, right? It's me as a buyer. Let's say I'm the acquisition person. It's me and the seller of that property figuring out the deal. Between us, everything in between, right? There's no middleman, there's no loan, there's none of that stuff. So that's kind of how we view creative financing.
Gotcha.
Cool.
So when you guys talk about sub-2, we've learned a lot about sub-2. What are some of the myths or wrong things you can do with sub-2 that you guys have found over the years that people are making mistakes on?
Yeah, I would say, I'm just going to repeat one of my absolute favorite sayings, and that is in regards to subject to, you may sit down with a seller and you may come to an agreement that the seller will sell you that property subject to the existing financing. But just because they will do it doesn't always mean that you should do it. And so for us, we realize that a lot of our deals, they're overlooked because the numbers they don't look attractive to your standard cash buyer. But one of the things I think that's misunderstood is everybody, and this is partially true. People talk about, you make money when you buy. Everybody's heard that at some point. But we kind of don't believe that, because with our strategies, we do believe it. Don't get me wrong. But with our strategies, our exit strategies, when we sell, depending upon how we sell that property, or for, in your guys' case, you're going to sell a note, we can get super, super creative. We can kind of create our own, what we like to say, our own little economy inside each deal.
Yeah.
And so we look at it on a deal by deal basis. We don't put ourselves in a box, and we like to look at both the acquisition side. If maybe our terms aren't the greatest on the acquisition side, we know if we have, the right location, all the specifics, that all the boxes that you need to check on the disposition side, we know that we can make a profit on most of these deals. But again, some deals just don't turn out. They just don't turn out that way. Some deals are just too far gone, and that's when you call your short sale guy, Yeah. So, yep.
Can I add something there too?
Yeah, please do, Ken.
The sub-2 stuff. I guess I just like to say one of the things that sub-2 that we'd like to be open and honest with the seller, right? Who's probably in some kind of financial distress, right? I need to get rid of the property, lost my job, I have to move, what divorce, you mentioned all that, whatever it is, right? And so they're looking to us as the buyer, right? The investor buyer coming in there to do the deal, and they need to have trust with us. And so we want to be transparent. We want to make sure that they understand what subject to means, right? Because their name's still staying on that underlying loan, right?
Right.
Sure.
They're going
Yeah.
to be responsible for the payments, but that's still a risk to them, and they need to understand all that. And as Jeff mentioned, I think subject to is not for every property. I think that's a big thing that we see too. You can't try to force a square peg into a round hole, so to speak.
Yeah. How do you guys do your best to avoid the due on sale with subject to?
That's one we've heard coming up lately.
This is 100% how you set up the structure in the beginning. Due on sale has never been a problem for us. I've known 3 people in my entire life that have ever experienced something like that. And it's not because the banks are out scouring public records and looking for LLCs, which, by the way, Fannie actually has guidelines now, as you guys may well know, that they accept people moving properties into LLCs all day long. How we normally do it, in the method that we prefer is we prefer to use trust. We use trust extensively. So it's a matter of how you set that trust up initially.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's one of the other things that we see is insurance. A lot of folks just don't know how to set that up correctly.
Yep.
But what it boils down to is, and you guys as note investors know this the most, and that is, if I'm making my payment to you, 99% of the time, you're not going to care where those funds come from.
Nope.
Right.
And so as long as that payment's made, and so that's, we push that super, super hard.
100% right.
Don't get yourself, if it's a deal where you even think remotely that this deal will not pay for itself or it can't afford to make those payments, then we just don't do it.
So you mentioned like the banks are not out necessarily looking for these kind of deals. However, are they keeping an eye out? Because if they've got a loan at 3% and they could be lending it out at 8%, are they kind of a little bit more aware than they were?
Again, yes, this has more to do with how it's structured in a trust, and they could go out and they could scour the public records for trust recordings, and they could, I'm sure they could go out and take a bunch of those to court and and probably win. But it's kind of, how do I want to say this? It's kind of protecting, it's building a structure that's going to protect you from that in the future, just by how you set it up on the front end, on the acquisition side. And so with the extensive use of trust, it doesn't put those red flags up like a lot of these other strategies might.
Yeah.
So it's all about doing it right in the beginning. That's what it's all about.
One of the things we found in the beginning of the year, and I'm curious how you guys teach your students, who does your servicing for your notes? Do you self-service? Do you use a licensed servicer, using software, or are you using something else?
So generally speaking, in order, and Ken, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of bringing it over. But generally speaking, we really like to use, on the disposition side, we really like to use land contracts.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so generally speaking, if our seller is really concerned about that payment being made, we will hire a note servicing company. We just went through one, BiFi. Is who we went through. I've used Evergreen before. We've used Madison Management before.
Yep.
So it just depends. It depends on how comfortable our seller is with making sure that payment's made. But for the most part, we either, it's kind of optional. It's not a standard, and that's what we teach. Is if the deal can support you self-servicing it, if you're not so busy that you can self-service, then go ahead and do that. Otherwise, let's hire a servicer.
One of the cool things we've learned is that, and another thing I would add into your contracts for those who follow you, is putting that servicing fee as a borrower expense. right? Because that makes us as note buyers a whole lot easier to buy for a little bit higher. If that payment is $300 a month and I have to pay $20 down a month, that's a little bit out of my paycheck, which means my bid has to be a little higher or a little lower to deal with that $20 for 180 months.
Right.
So yeah, I would ideally put that in the buyer side of it. Nathan's more comfortable with land contracts than I am. And it's a preference, right? But I understand why you guys do it in a land contract versus a note mortgage, because technically then the deed's changing hands again, which makes it a little bit more convoluted. But it's good to see you guys are open to that servicing mentality.
Yeah, and actually we're going through this right now. In fact, Ken and I both went to court yesterday, and it's on an eviction on a land contract. And the fact is, you know, we have it's much easier to get someone out of a property off of a land contract than it is and cheaper than it is to foreclose. So
where was the property at?
It's in Illinois.
Illinois,
yeah.
just like the Chicago.
Yeah, we're talking pretty.
Your Chicago story was near and dear to our hearts. Yeah.
So
I was just there yesterday.
The one thing I'd be careful of are debt licenses, right? Technically in Illinois, debt license is a requirement. You can look up all the penalties on stuff, but there are certain states that require ownership. If you have a debt and you're collecting on a debt, you're supposed to be having a debt license in your name. I won't get into what happens if not or whatever, but just for people listening, and that's a certain thing. I don't buy in Illinois because I don't want to get the license. Plus, dealing with Cook County is too long of a time frame for anything, right? But there's states like Georgia where it's a 90-day foreclosure, but it requires a debt license unless you're buying your personal name. Well, then go get the debt license. It makes sense, right? That kind of stuff makes a lot of sense for a lot of us to talk about. When we talk with you guys regarding, you know, these wrap notes, how do you lay it out to that original borrower that may want to look for a house a year, 2 years from now? How do you structure that conversation? Ken, how do you deal with the borrower who's like, hey, you're paying my payment for me, but I want to go buy a house 3 years from now. Yeah. And their debt's wrapped up.
So that has a lot of layers to it, that particular conversation. So usually, all right, the seller is distressed in some way. And so the likelihood that they're going to be in a position to actually go and get a traditional institutional mortgage and qualify again in 12 to 24 to 36 months is probably pretty low. So I think it's some education, again, being transparent with the seller, some education on what the actual situation is. You know, we're going to take this note, we're going to take this property subject to, but we're going to pay your $30,000 in arrears to do that, right? And so that's going to affect your ability to go out there in 24 to 36 months and do anything. So I think that's the first piece of it, right? The seller education. And then the second piece of it is we, you know, they're within after 12 months, after some seasoning, right, they can then discount some up to 50% or if not all of that that loan if they can prove someone else is making the payments for them. And so we provide that information too. And we actually just did this in that same property we're talking about in Illinois. We provided a note because they wanted to go out and buy a different property, that we were responsible for the payments. The payments had been made by us for X amount of time, and then they were able to get approved under that lender. Now that doesn't work for everybody, but we certainly do that, saying that we've taken the obligation for those payments and it shouldn't count against them or not fully count against them when they're trying to qualify again. And we also try to, you know, we take over a subject to note, and it might be, let's say it's 5 years in, so it's got 25 years left on the term. Like the likelihood that we're going to make 25 more years of payments on that is pretty slim, right? Like we're going to get refinanced by our third party buyer that we bring in, right? We're going to get refinanced out in 3 or 4 or 5 years, right? Whatever term we put into the land contracts, right? We like to do that. And in a certain amount of time, they're going to balloon us out, refi us out, and then we're going to get, you know, the final payment, that third piece of the payment on a sub-2 deal on the backside. So I think it's just education and letting them know, like, here's our plan. Like, there's no guarantee. You're correct. We might make payments for another 25 years, but the likelihood of that's probably pretty slim.
Yeah.